The desert did not forgive mistakes. It swallowed men whole, their ambitions, their certainties, their carefully drawn maps, and returned nothing but silence and heat. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of North Africa, where the sand shifted beneath the boots of armies that had crossed oceans to fight over it, one man had become something close to a legend, not because he was invincible, but because everyone, including his enemies, had begun to believe he might be. And then, quietly, almost without ceremony, the British captured him. What happened next was not what anyone expected. They protected him. To understand why, you have to understand what the war had become by that point. Britain had been fighting, truly fighting, bleeding and retreating and clawing its way back, for years. Well, the early days of the conflict had been ones of desperate improvisation. Dunkirk had carved something into the British national memory that no speech could fully undo. The sense that disaster was always closer than it appeared, that the ground beneath you could give way at any moment. But something had changed. Slowly, painfully, at enormous cost, Britain had begun to move forward. The army that now advanced across North Africa was not the same army that had once scrambled for the beaches of France. It had been forged in fire, it had learned, and it had begun, for the first time in a long time, to believe that victory was not merely possible, it was coming. Germany's expectations were about to meet something they had not been built to withstand. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been the sharpest edge of German ambition in Africa. What his movement was extraordinary. His ability to read a battlefield, to strike before his enemy had fully processed what was happening, had earned him a reputation that crossed enemy lines. British soldiers who faced him, who watched their comrades fall to his tactics, spoke of him with a reluctant, unsettling admiration. Winston Churchill himself had stood in the House of Commons and acknowledged Rommel's skill on the battlefield, before quickly adding that the British would face him and prevail. That acknowledgement was not given lightly. It was given because the situation demanded honesty, because to pretend otherwise would have been to ignore what the men on the ground already knew, that they were facing something formidable. But formidable was not the same as undefeatable. The tide had turned at El Alamein. Slowly, then decisively. General Bernard Montgomery, methodical and cold in his calculations, had met Rommel's force and refused to be broken. The British Eighth Army held. Then it pushed. Then it pushed harder. The Germans and Italians fell back across Libya. The Allies poured into Tunisia from the west. The vice closed. By May of 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa had nowhere left to go. The sea was at their back. The British and Americans were in front of them. The campaign that Rommel had made famous, that had, at its peak, threatened Egypt and the Suez Canal itself, was over. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered. It was a capitulation that echoed Stalingrad, a catastrophe for the Axis, cause that could not be softened with careful words. But Rommel himself was not among those who surrendered. He had been recalled months earlier. His health had been failing, genuinely, not as an excuse, and Hitler had ordered him home before the final collapse. What that meant, in the strange arithmetic of war and legend, was that Rommel had escaped the defeat that ended the campaign he had defined. He had not been taken prisoner at the moment of collapse. He had not shared the fate of his men. He would, eventually, share a different kind of fate. But that comes later. The German general who the British did capture, the one who entered British custody, not as an obscure officer, but as a figure of real significance, was General Jürgen von Arnim. He had inherited command of Army Group Africa in its dying days. He had not been given an army so much as a situation, a command that meant presiding over the final hours of a campaign already decided, you waiting for the end to arrive. When it came, von Arnim surrendered. He was a Prussian officer, old in his bearing, in his manner, in his understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. He did not make dramatic gestures. He did not attempt to escape. He accepted captivity with the austere composure of a man who had served a military tradition that was, in many ways, already passing from the world, whether he understood that or not. The British looked at him and made a decision. They would treat him as a prisoner of war, properly, by the rules, with the quiet formality that the conventions of warfare demanded. But there was more to it than that. There was a deliberateness to how von Arnim was handled that went beyond mere procedural compliance. He was protected, not from physical danger. The fighting in Tunisia was over, yet the immediate threat of the battlefield had passed. He was protected from something else, from humiliation, from being paraded, from being made into a spectacle for propaganda, a trophy displayed before cameras to demonstrate British dominance. The Americans, it was reported, had different instincts. When von Arnim passed through American hands briefly, there were those who saw the propaganda value in the moment. Here was a senior German general, captured, defeated, on his way to a prisoner of war camp. Surely there was something to be made of this. Surely the cameras should capture it. The British said no. The reasoning was partly philosophical. Britain's military establishment had a long tradition, sometimes honoured more in word than deed, but a tradition nonetheless, of respecting a captured enemy who had fought according to the rules of war. Von Arnim had not been accused of atrocities. He was a soldier, captured in the field. The Geneva Convention existed for exactly this moment, and beyond the convention there was something else, a belief that how you treated a defeated enemy said something about who you were. But there was also calculation. The war was not over, not remotely. North Africa had been secured, but what came next, the invasion of Sicily, the long, grinding campaign up the Italian peninsula, eventually the crossing into France, was still ahead. Tens of thousands of British soldiers were still fighting, or would soon be fighting. Some of them would be captured. And what happened to German generals in British custody would be watched, noted, and measured against how British prisoners of war were treated by Germany. This was the cold, unspoken logic beneath the decision. If you humiliate their generals, you give them permission, or at least additional motivation, to worsen the treatment of your men. The protection of von Arnim was, in part, a form of insurance written in the currency of military dignity. There was something else too. Intelligence. A senior captured officer, treated well, kept comfortable, handled with the kind of professional respect that he might not have expected, was more likely to talk, or at least less likely to actively resist being around conversations he should not be hearing. The British had developed, over the course of the war, a sophisticated apparatus for extracting intelligence from prisoners. Not through torture, through patience, or through comfort, through the careful management of an environment in which a prisoner slowly, sometimes without realizing it, revealed things. Von Arnim himself was careful. He was not a man who talked carelessly, but the principle held regardless of what any individual prisoner chose to say. You caught more with silk than with rope. He was taken to Britain, held in a prisoner of war facility. And beyond those walls, the war continued. Germany was still fighting. The Eastern Front was consuming lives at a rate that beggared comprehension. The skies over Germany were filling with Allied bombers. The industrial logic of the conflict, the relentless, grinding application of superior resources, was beginning to tell. But none of that meant the end was near, or certain, or predictable. It only meant that the direction of travel had changed. Britain, for its part, was now unambiguously on the offensive, not just militarily, psychologically. The hesitation of the early years, the defensive crouch, the calculation of survival rather than victory, had been replaced by something different, a forward momentum that was, by now, almost impossible to stop, not because the British were reckless. Montgomery was the opposite of reckless. The entire apparatus of British command in this period was meticulous, sometimes maddeningly so, but it moved forward. It kept moving forward. Von Arnim, sitting in his prisoner of war facility somewhere in the English countryside, knew this as well as anyone. He had watched Army Group Africa collapse. He had seen what Allied material superiority looked like up close, in the desert, where there was nowhere to hide, and no room for elegant manoeuvre when you were outgunned and outfed and out-everything. He understood, with the clarity available only to those who have been defeated, what was now a raid against his country. What he thought about that, no one recorded with any precision. What is recorded is that he remained there, in British custody, as the war moved through its remaining chapters without him. Sicily fell. The Italian government collapsed. The landings in Normandy came, and with them the beginning of the end that everyone had felt approaching for some time. The Eastern Front continued its catastrophic consumption of German armies, and somewhere in England a Prussian general waited. The decision to protect him, to refuse the propaganda opportunity, to insist on the formality of proper treatment, yet to deny the cameras their moment, had not been made from weakness. It had been made from a position of growing strength, and it reflected something important about how Britain chose to exercise that strength. There is a particular kind of power that does not need to display itself, that does not require the humiliation of a defeated enemy to feel real or validated. Britain in 1943 was beginning, slowly, to rediscover that kind of power. It had survived. It was advancing. It no longer needed to compensate for fear with cruelty or for uncertainty with spectacle. This is not to paint a picture that is too clean or too flattering. War is not clean, and Britain was not without its own moral failures in this period and others. But in this specific moment, with this specific man, the decision made was a considered one. And the consideration behind it said something about where Britain now stood. Not scrambling to hold on, not desperate for symbols of resistance, but methodical, forward-moving, and in its way, confident enough to be restrained. Rommel, the general the world had actually heard of, the name that meant something to newspaper readers and newsreel audiences, was beyond British reach. He was in Germany, recovering, being given new commands by a Führer who could not quite bring himself to fully believe that Africa was gone. He would eventually be assigned to defend France against the invasion that both sides knew was coming. He would be at Normandy, and then, later, he would be somewhere else entirely, drawn into the orbit of the conspiracy against Hitler, the desperate or final attempt by a fractured German officer corps to end the war before Germany was completely destroyed. What happened to him after that is a different story. A darker one that ends not in a prisoner of war camp in the English countryside, but in a car on a road in Germany, with a choice that was not really a choice at all. Von Arnim's story ends more quietly. He survived the war. He was held in British custody until after Germany's surrender. He was not put on trial at Nuremberg. There was no case to bring. He had been a soldier in a war fighting for his country, and while that country's cause was monstrous, he himself had not been found to have committed the acts that sent others to the gallows or to prison. He was released. He returned to what was left of Germany. He lived until 1962. Whilst the war that had consumed everything he had known, the army, the command structure, the Prussia that had made him, was gone long before he was. What does it mean that the British protected him? It means several things at once, and none of them resolve neatly. It means that Britain, in the autumn of its long defensive war and the dawn of its offensive one, chose to conduct itself according to a set of rules it believed in. Not perfectly, not without exception, but in this case, clearly and deliberately. It means that warfare, even at its most brutal, contains within it decisions that are not purely military. Decisions about what kind of force you want to be, what precedents you want to set, what the world will look like when the fighting stops, and who you will be required to deal with in that aftermath. Well, it means that the treatment of von Arnim was, in its quiet way, a statement, not a triumphant one, not a banner raised, just a decision made in a room somewhere by men who were winning but had not forgotten what it was to be losing, and who understood that the two conditions were never as far apart as they seemed. The desert had been unforgiving. It had consumed ambitions and certainties and carefully drawn maps, but the men who walked out of it, on both sides, carried something with them. The weight of what they had seen, the knowledge of what the war could do and what it would yet do before it was finished. Von Arnim carried it into a prisoner of war camp in England. The British carried it forward into Sicily, into Italy, across the Channel, into Germany itself. And in the space between defeat and victory, in the strange, suspended moment when one man's war was over and another's was only beginning to end, a decision was made that history barely noticed. They could have displayed him. They chose not to. The war went on.